Hello, Thomas, can I control from my side or I'll? Hello, okay, thank you. I think there's a bit of delay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you well. I think you can
Oh, okay.
go on.
The slides are moving fast. Can you go to the first slide?
Is it that one?
Thomas, you might want to go to the second one, which is, I think Charmaine described what is the narrative for the exercise, so we all understand what is the objective exactly. Over to you, colleagues.
Do you want it to start from here?
Yes, I think that was the suggestion that we should go back to this slide so that everybody can understand what is the objective of the exercise. We chose task 2. We chose task 2. The task was, imagine you are the business operator of a furniture unit that is part of component exporting meat to country X based on chapter 4.5, application of compartmentalization of the terrestrial animal health code and principles in the compartmentalization guidelines, referring to page 19 to 25, appendices 3, 11, and 12. Identify potential routes for ASF entry and measures to address these risks. Questions to be answered. What are possible risk pathways for ASFV entry into compartment? Second question, what measures should be taken to manage this risk? Next slide, please. For the possible risk pathways for entry into a compartment, we considered introduction of new pigs like the growers, because we are running a finisher unit, so we'll be buying the grower pigs in from various sources. Then there'll be inputs, live pig inputs such as the feeds and the bedding materials. Then there'll be vehicles that will be loading and offloading live pigs and bringing in pig inputs to the compartment. Then there would be waste that is generated from old bedding and excreta from the pigs. And also there might be some mortalities. So there'll be people coming from outside to collect the dead pigs for disposal. Then we said another risk could be feeding of swill. And then also for reproductive purposes, semen would be used. It will be brought from outside. Then we say the risk pathways, the other risk would be mixing of pigs from various suppliers and also mixing different age groups. And we said the other risk would be visitors and employees. And next slide, please. The measures that should be taken to manage the risks that we have already identified include sourcing of grower pigs from African swine fever-free compartments or free zones or free countries. And when we do this, part of the requirements would be to request for evidence of freedom from disease. And then we have quarantine before pigs move to the facility, and also negative tests for African swine fever. And also we should have a traceability system so that we know where all pigs have been sourced from. And then also for the pig inputs, they should be sourced from trusted suppliers with health certificates. And then the feed should be sampled and tested just to check if there is possible contamination. And also the food should be sourced from feed mills that implement the HACCP or are ISO certified. And also for the vehicles that come to the farm and leave the farm, they should be cleaned and disinfected. And the drivers for the various vehicles, like for those that come for waste collection or collection of the dead pigs, or those who are bringing in feed or equipment to the farm, they should also be trained on how they should conduct themselves, and also on matters of disinfection and cleaning of the vehicles. And also commercially formulated feeds should be used instead of using shrill feed. And also to source semen from ASFB-free compartments, and also have screening tests. Only semen from ASFB-free pigs should be used. And also as part of management practice, to use all-in, all-out approach, whereby you'll be keeping pigs of the same age, and you move them out at the same time, and then clean in between the litters, and have the controlled access to the piggery establishments. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see that's the end of the presentation. Do
Yes,
we
that's
go?
all.
Do we go to the other country presentations if they are there, or Gregorio, give us some guidance?
Probably, thanks, Thomas, and thanks, colleague from Botswana. I think you captured quite well. Of course, this is just an academic exercise, so we were not expecting a full risk pathways identification and characterization, but I think you did capture the main point. The idea is of compartment, as we discussed in the session, was we need to create a bubble where everything in the compartment remains free. So you choose task 2, because task 1 was to identify the units. So what kind of units were part of the compartment? Here we are talking about finisher. Something you mentioned was that to make sure that the animals, the live pigs, come either from the compartment, so upstream units, or you could bring from the outside, but that will require a certain level of testing and quarantine to ensure that there is nothing coming into the compartment. So it's absolutely fine. You also identify different sort of contamination that could be something like vehicles or input like feed, genetic. This is also very important, but they need to come from a certified, or if it's not part of the compartment, they need to come from a certified. Something which is probably was not part of the not part of the task of the exercise, but I think it's extremely important when it comes to compartmentalization, which is actually documentation. All these things need to be well documented, because as we discussed in the session, it's not only high biosecurity units, this need to be audited, and this need to be shared with your trade partner, either international trade partner or national trade partner. But documentation that allows monitoring of the implementation of the measure, it's absolutely necessary. I only got a minor remarks on your production system, that you advise all in, all out system, which, I mean, this is, why not? This is probably the safest and probably quite common practice. But according to my understanding, neither the guidelines or international standard recommend a particular production system. So in-out, all-in, all-out system is definitely good, but it's, I want to clarify that it's not mandatory. It's not just an obligation for maintaining a compartment. Probably the only thing I want to share before we move, I want to share the, let's see if I can share my screen, because there is a nice, and you need to see, do you see my screen, Thomas?
Yes, I can see it very clearly.
Right, this is the African swine fever compartmentalization guidelines that put some practical example in the implementation of the international standard, chapter 4.4 and 4.5. And here in the annex, you see diagrams just to help countries to understand what is a risk pathways and try to identify all the potential sort of infection. So these guidelines will need to be used by our countries, our colleagues, so they can be inspired and they understand what are the different elements that can influence or can have an impact in the incursion. So again, in the guidelines, you will have some practical examples, some descriptive examples. So this is Annex, let me check, it's Annex 3, I think, yeah, Appendix 3. So it's, you can read a little bit more in details about what is the risk pathways. And of course, as our colleagues just have done, every single risk pathway should be allocated to a risk mitigation measure. So all these things need to be implemented in the compartment. And as I previously said, they need to be well documented. So the productions and the veterinary authorities are able to document that the compartment is well implemented. So that being said, good job, colleague from Botswana. I'm quite impressed. You put quite a lot of information in your 2 slides. So absolutely very good job. Thanks. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you. I can see, are there any questions from the other participants to that presentation from Botswana? You can raise your hand or put it on the chat box. If there are none, I can see a participant from Eswatini, Dr. Sile Mdululi, if I'm not wrong. I saw her join. Are you there, Sile? Sile, before you joined, we were giving countries a chance to present their session 4 presentations, which you didn't have a chance during session 5. And you had chosen task 2 of the compartmentalization homework. So if you are ready, you can give me an instruction to share the screen so that you can share your presentations with the rest of the participants. Over. Eswatini, are you ready to give your presentation? The last call, Eswatini, are you ready to give your presentation?
It's muted.
I think I'm in the house.
She just joined. Anyway.
I can't see them in the house.
Yeah, maybe you can see on the participants list, Eswatini is there. There's a Sile Mudluli, but she's not responding. Anyway, I think if they don't volunteer to come on because she's muted, I'm checking for Tanzania and Uganda. They're also not there. The participants from Tanzania was traveling from Dodoma to, Arusha towards Dodoma. And he thought if he made it on time, he would join to participate, but I can't see them right now. The Ugandans have not also come on. So Eswatini, the last call. Okay. Over to you, Gregorio, for direction. What do I do?
Thanks, Thomas. I think the basic principle of risk pathways with example of Botswana has been good enough. And so I think I would probably need to move on. I don't know if our experts want to make any comments on the risk pathways identification on risk management, in particular based on what Botswana has just presented.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. I would hand it over to Dr. Noel, the team leader of session 5, and Professor Tim Carpenter, so that they can make their comments and take over the session from there.
Okay, thanks, Thomas.
Yeah.
I think we've had a look at some of the examples on compartmentalization, and it's certainly identified the relevant risk factors and focusing on biosecurity in particular. So it's probably time to look at do you want to look at the exercises from session 5? I think we've had 5 countries provide feedback, and 3 of them came in overnight, which for Tim and I has meant very early this morning. So I've had a look at those 3 that came in, had a quick look. I don't know, we've probably pretty short for time today, it seems, whether we can have a look at a couple of them and maybe make some comments or observations. I see we've got Botswana, Eswatini, and Namibia have joined us. Tanzania and Uganda not yet. So I wonder if we can start with Botswana. Would someone from Botswana be interested in just taking us through their exercise from session 5? And we can just have a quick summation or walk through from one of the participants from Botswana, and then we can have a discussion about that.
So, yeah, thanks, Noel. Thomas, could you help us out? Could you tell us how much time we have for this?
We had slated in some 60 minutes for that exercise.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's nothing much. There are no presentations. It's just it is an interaction from the participants, what they have prepared as homework, and immediately we are through with that, then we go to the closing ceremony. So
well, there was going to be a quiz today too, but if we'll see how we go.
True.
But I think if we can start with the presentations first, that'd be great. So, any volunteers, or do we go alphabetical order? So, would someone from Botswana like to walk us through their session 5 exercise?
I think Dr. Kimulat is ready also for that one today.
Okay, if you are ready, you can go ahead to share your screen. If you are able to do that, if you're not, you can ask any of us to share the screen for you.
Sorry, I'm just checking on my colleague again.
Can I share the screen for your presentation?
Dr. Thomas, you can go ahead and share the screen while I'm conferring with him.
Okay.
Dr. Thomas, I'm informed he's put some meetings, some emergency meeting on avian influenza. So I'll stand in for him.
Okay, you can see the screen.
Yes, I can. If you may just proceed to the next slide.
You
Okay.
can go ahead. Yeah.
This was the assignment. We are all familiar with the assignment. Maybe we may just proceed to the next slide. We are supposed to come up with entries.
The connection is not very good.
Did you start from the first? I do not think this is the one that I'm supposed to start with. Can I email in another one? I don't understand. This one seems to be jumbled up. This is not the order that I am supposed to follow, I think. Try the next slide. Let's see what is on the next slide.
So continue on to the next slide till you get to the scenario tree that they've mapped out. There you go. That's the beginning slide of the exercise.
Yeah, that's where I will begin from. So is it possible to send that? Okay, we've got some noise in the background here.
Yeah, all the others who are not talking are supposed to mute their microphones. Go ahead.
Are you able to narrate so that it can fit or raise it up? Dr. Thomas, can you hear me?
I can't hear what you're saying. Your communication is cutting. I'm just
like
showing.
I'm not winning here.
Yeah, I'm showing the presentation as you presented to us, as you submitted to us, and there's nothing much I can do, like centering it. That's the way it is prepared. So continue.
Dr. Thomas, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Maybe I stop the sharing the screen and restart again because we can't hear you anymore. It looks
Okay,
like there's
Thomas, it's Noel here. So one suggestion, if we're having trouble with people with their connection, we could, if you project the screen and then I can step through each slide and just make some comments or observations as we go. So if you want to bring up Botswana, I know it's not ideal. Ideally, we would like to hear from from one
Okay.
of the representatives from each of the countries, but if the connectivity is not working out so well, let's just try the alternative. So if you can bring this presentation back up, there we go.
Let me try to connect. Try to connect through my phone. It looks like I'm having issues with connectivity here. Looks like I'm having challenges with network here.
Okay, one of the Dr. Noel has decided to run the presentation for you and make comments where they think you have not put correctly or where there's some weakness, or even point out the strength out of your presentation. So Noel, I think I can give you a chance to continue from here.
Okay. Yeah, no, I must say I'm impressed with each of the countries, the work that they've done on these exercises. It's very well considered, well thought through. So just quickly going through, I think for Botswana, they've clearly laid out the risk pathways for the entry assessment, leading from an infected pig being selected for export. I think this one was looking at pork. So if I understand it, this would be meat derived from an infected pig potentially. Leading to our outcome of interest there, which is in the red box, African swine fever virus contaminates the meat that is being imported. So the first step there, it's stepped through quite logically. Infected pig selected for export, it's sent to slaughter. It's not detected at animal post-mortem inspection. The virus is present in the meat, survives the cold storage, and then it survives storage and transport to the importing country, leading to our outcome of interest. Okay, so if you go to the next slide. Now they've got the various factors that were considered in each one of these steps. It's clearly laid out. I won't go through it all, but just the first step there, looking at the prevalence in the country of origin, what sort of biosecurity or surveillance programs may be in place, etc. So one thing, I guess, with any risk analysis, remember right at the very beginning, I emphasized it's really important to define the purpose and the scope of the analysis. So part of that is helping to define the commodity. What is it about the commodity that we're particularly interested in? So in this case, it may well be in defining the commodity that it would be fresh or chilled or frozen pork. I'm just imagining what might be the case. Imported from say a compartment, a free compartment in a country. So you've got that would help to define the commodity. So it really narrows it down. Alternatively, you could look at importing pig meat, grilled, chilled or frozen, whatever, from a country, irregardless of what the herd of origin might be. So anyway, it just depends on how you scope it out and what help to decide the question that you're going to answer. But in this case here, we're looking at the various factors that they've taken into account, and I think that's pretty comprehensive. It's pretty complete. So the next slide. Now they've estimated the likelihood for each one of the steps and flowing through until the outcome of interest. There would, of course, be some rationale as to why, for example, the likelihood an infected pig is selected for export. You know, perhaps it comes from a compartment where African swine fever is well controlled. It's the compartment's free. And then if the animal was infected, what's the chance that it would be selected for slaughter? And they estimated a moderate likelihood of that. Not detected at ante or post-mortem inspection, moderate likelihood of that. And then, of course, if the animal was infected and was slaughtered and the meat, African swine fever virus is present in the meat, there's a high likelihood that that would would survive cold storage, etc., because we know it's very resistant. So next slide. Now we're combining the likelihood estimates. So in this case, they're saying that the first step was low, the second step moderate, and talking here about product of likelihoods. I'm not a proponent of this type of approach. I know it's certainly out there in the literature where people will say, if I combine a low plus a moderate, it equals low. So in this case, I think that's probably reasonable because the least likely step so far is low. So low, the overall outcome of steps 1 and 2 could be no greater or less than the least likely event that's occurred so far, which is this one here, low. And then we step it on through. So moderate, high, and high. So overall, the risk estimate is a low likelihood of pork being contaminated when it's imported from an endemic country. So you can see there that even though there's a high, the steps in 4 and 5 are high, the overall likelihood estimate is informed by the least likely event in the chain, which is low. Okay, all right, so that's good. Next slide. So now we're looking at the exposure pathway leading from our initiating event. In this case, the pig meat is contaminated when it's imported. And does that lead to the outcome of interest? Now, at this point, Botswana's got at least one pig infected. Now, in my presentation or under the OE framework, we're not looking at the consequences of pigs being exposed, which would be, does the pig become infected or not? That's considered in the consequence assessment step. So in the exposure assessment step under the OE framework, it's really looking at what is the likelihood that one or more pigs may be exposed, okay? So it's not what's the outcome from that exposure, what would be, what's the likelihood that at least one becomes infected? That's the consequence assessment. So just a small point there. So the other steps are quite fine. Looking at contaminated meat forms part of the swill or waste. Does it survive the swill treatment, the heat treatment? Is it fed to backyard pigs? And then does that lead to exposure? So at this stage, we're not really interested in an effective dose. We're just interested in whether backyard pigs are exposed or not. So some of this could well be those last two steps would, or the last step there would be in the consequence assessment, ideally. Okay, next slide. So now we're looking at the various factors, the impact that they would have that feed into our likelihood estimates. So cooking practices, waste management practices, the impact of those on survival of the virus. So we've got some background noise there. So what's the impact of cooking on the survival of the virus? And does that lead to the swill being contaminated or not? And then we move on to whether or not that swill's fed to backyard pigs, and on we go. Okay, so next slide. And then they've estimated their likelihoods at the various steps in the pathway there. As we can see, it's nicely laid out. It's very clear. It's a really good example of a scenario tree with each of the steps clearly laid out. Next slide. So in the exposure assessment, they considered a number of risk factors, as we can see there. Considering that the virus itself is highly resistant to low temperatures, so it's going to survive cold storage, both during pre-export and during transportation. Survives a wide range of pH. It survives for long periods in tissues, including undercooked pork. Feeding of untreated or poorly treated swill is apparently a common practice in smallholder pig farms, so it can survive in poorly treated swill quite well. There's no effective vaccine, as we know. The vectors, I'm not sure about the situation in Botswana, whether vectors exist or not, but perhaps they've identified that they do potentially exist. Other hosts include warthogs, so there's potential for spillover into those species. Recovered pigs may become persistently infected and act as a virus carrier, so that's an important consideration as well. But that really would be ideally in the consequence assessment. So remember, here in the exposure assessment, we're just interested in what's the likelihood of susceptible species being exposed to the virus in the commodity of interest. Okay, so in that regard, the commodity being infected or contaminated pork, and the pathway leading to potential exposure would be via swill. I don't think that would be a plausible pathway that would lead to vectors being exposed. Potentially warthogs if they have access to, I don't know how that would happen either, but anyway. But the main one would be the smallholder pig farms, I guess. Next slide. So once again, they've estimated the overall likelihood of susceptible pigs being exposed was estimated to be very low. So in this case, we have the least likely event in the chain here from L1 through to L5 is low. I would disagree with the product of the likelihoods here, because we've now got a very low estimate there for L5 at that step, the outcome from that, the series of events. I would think in a qualitative risk analysis like this, I would recommend that we just stay with the least likely event in the chain, which in this case is low. So the overall estimate would be low rather than very low. I don't think there's sufficient information to really conclude that somehow the overall risk estimate is lower than the least likely event in the chain. I know this occurs in the literature. I don't agree with it. I think if you go, what people are trying to do here, I guess, is to manipulate our likelihood estimates based on some sort of mathematical logic, but that's not applicable in a qualitative assessment. We of course may come to a different conclusion if we undertake a quantitative risk analysis, but in that case we would be developing a specific model with distributions representing our different variables and undertaking a simulation that may well lead us to a conclusion of very low, but that's under the very specific circumstance of a quantitative risk analysis. In a good qualitative risk analysis like this one, I would recommend that the overall summary of the likelihood in this case would be low, okay? So next slide. So looking now at consequences, direct consequences in backyard pig holdings, exposure to an infected dose in our swill, leading to various outcomes, production losses, including abortions and mortalities, impacts on animal welfare, perhaps a shortage of pork, which drives the prices higher. That's a legitimate concern or consequence because it is a direct result of an outcome from the hazard of interest. Loss of employment and protein source. That's also legitimate if it's associated with the hazard being introduced, spreading and becoming established, leading to undesired consequences, but then have these flow-on impacts which are associated with our hazard. And as well as environmental impacts, disposal of dead pigs, and then of course economic considerations in terms of cost of control. Okay, so that's a nice summary there of the direct consequences. Next slide, please. Some indirect consequences that they considered, impacts on the environment through disposal of carcasses, I would imagine. It may affect water quality. Economic impacts, I think that was mentioned before, the cost of control. Some of these may well be considered direct impacts too. And perhaps some of the indirect impacts, if we go back to the preceding slide, slide number 15, Thomas. No, go back 15. So perhaps we could, this is a minor point really, but shortage of pork, which drives up prices, loss of employment, maybe they're more indirect, but nevertheless relevant consequences. So it's really the impacts on the affected animals directly. That sort of thing would be direct. But nevertheless, they've managed to capture the relevant consequences, which is great. So next slide, number 17, I think we need to jump to. Some outbreak scenarios that were thought about. It doesn't spread within the backyard holding. Perhaps it spreads within that backyard holding, but it's quickly identified and eradicated. It establishes in the backyard holding and then spreads or spills over into other backyard holdings before it's identified and eradicated, and so on. And we work through the last scenario there, establishes that various backyard pig populations at the national level it becomes endemic. So that's a good consideration of a number of potential outbreak scenarios. It's quite clearly laid out, which is great. Next slide. So now we've got our consequence assessment, looking at scenario trees there. So following on from susceptible pigs being exposed. So in this case, this is the outcome from the exposure assessment. And then here in the consequence assessment, what's the probability or likelihood that at least one pig would become infected, and then leading to our different scenarios, spread to other pigs on the farm, maybe it spreads to other pigs within the district, and so on up to the national level. And our various outcomes of interest there in terms of scenarios 2, 3, and 4 and 5. So that's a really nice scenario pathway. Okay, scenario tree. So next slide. So here they've estimated the consequences at various levels. This is a really nice table. It transparently documents all the relevant considerations. So depending on the scenario, if it's at the small holder or farm level, that likelihood of that scenario was considered to be high. If susceptible pigs were exposed to contaminated swill, there's a high likelihood that that would result in transmission of the virus. And then the associated consequences were considered to be high. You know, obviously the animals themselves, potentially a high morbidity or mortality rate, etc. At the national level, it was considered that if it was restricted to that, it would be negligible. And then as we work down through these different scenarios, we can see it's very nicely laid out. It's very impressive. Up to the national level, be a moderate likelihood of that scenario was considered with high biological or economic consequences, and the significance at the national level would be high. So that's a really nice summation. Of course, in a risk analysis where you had sufficient time, these conclusions here would be supported by a reasoned and logical, transparently documented discussion. But nevertheless, for the purposes of this exercise, it's a really nice summary. So next slide. So the environmental consequences ranges from low to moderate. This is a summary of overall the consequence assessment. Biological consequences high at any level through the impacts directly on the animals, particularly mortalities, I imagine. The economic consequences were also considered to be high at any level, costs associated with compensation during eradication, as well as disease surveillance. So that's a nice summary of that. Next slide. The overall risk estimate for importing pork was considered to be low. The risk of establishment, there's a low risk of becoming established due to imported pork, contaminated pork. The likelihood of it being introduced was considered to be low, but the likelihood of spreading through untreated, poorly treated swill was high. And then there was a high likelihood of severe consequences arising. So overall, sanitary measures were deemed justifiable for the importation of pork, as the overall entry, exposure and consequence assessment steps were greater than negligible. So that's a good summary of our risk estimate. Next slide. So in terms of risk mitigation, I guess these are factors to consider. Importing pork from a free country or zone or compartment. Verify health certification accompanying imported pork, looking at product traceability, as well as the exporting country providing assurance with regard to disease freedom, their biosecurity measures in place, as well as diagnostic tests and results and surveillance that would underpin their claims about disease status, whether it's the country, zone, or a compartment. Looks like they considered to develop a legal framework to prohibit the use of untreated swill. That would be a mitigation measure applied within the importing country, increasing stakeholder awareness. So I guess that's related to swill feeding, and then perhaps a surveillance program. Okay, so next slide. So the factors they considered when developing measures, we could see there the type and level of production, looking at the likelihood of exposure and establishment, the magnitude of the consequences. They were aiming to obviously minimize the likelihood of any incursions, as well as being mindful of international trade agreements, including the SBS and OE standards. So that's a good summary of the factors that would need to be considered when deciding on measures. Next slide. And that's it. So I think overall, Botswana's done a great job. It's a really nice example, and I think it quite clearly lays out using a scenario tree the pathways that lead to the outcome of interest in the entry, exposure, and consequence assessment, and then assisting us in providing likelihood estimates for each one of the steps in the pathway, and coming to a conclusion in our risk estimate. So it's well done. Any comments from you, Tim?
I totally agree with what you said, Noel. It was a very complete and well thought out presentation. The only comment I would have extra, I guess, is to reiterate what you said about qualitative versus quantitative risk assessments. And I'm used to doing the quantitative and looking at the string of probabilities going through the pathway and multiplying them together, so that if you have a series of low with some high risk thrown in, I would look at that as a moderate to low, as opposed to what you're saying is if it's low, it's low, it's low, even if it's high. So it's something new to me, which is good. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that just sort of, we're using the information available to us. So, qualitative risk analysis, I don't think we can go further and somehow infer something that's lower than the least likely event in our pathway. But as I said, with the quantitative analysis, we're delving in a lot more detail, doing some modeling. It may well lead to a different risk estimate, but that's based on quite a lot of detail in the modeling and using distributions to represent variables, etc. It's quite a discipline in its own right.
Yeah. So in your experience, Noel, when would it go from the qualitative to quantitative?
I think I tried to emphasize in my presentation last week that for the vast majority of risk analysis, the type of work that we're doing to support trade or disease control within a country, a good qualitative assessment is really all that you need. For the vast majority of decision making, a good qualitative assessment is enough. And it may be in some instances you want to gain further insights into particular aspects, and a quantitative model may help support that. I think in the past, to my mind, there's been way too much emphasis on quantification. It is a discipline where you do need a lot of additional training in terms of developing expertise in modeling, statistics maybe, and so forth. But I think for routine decision making, a good, robust qualitative assessment is going to get you there.
There are some comments on and questions on the chat box, which I would want to draw your attention to.
Okay, so did you have one in mind? Let me just go back to see where. Okay, in Botswana scenario 3, would it be reasonable to model the herd and within herd prevalence separately if the scope is left open? Yes, it would if you had that information. It depends on the, as I said right at the beginning, the scope of the analysis. Are we looking at importing pig meat from any country, any herd within a country, or is it a particular subset? It may be from a compartment. So that's going to inform you of the necessity to look at herd level prevalence or within herd prevalence, those sort of estimates. But I think if within our scope, if we're looking at importing pig meat, chilled or frozen from a compartment that's certified as free of, then it's a bit of a different driver as opposed to looking at importing pig meat from any particular or from any herd in a country. So it depends on the scope a bit. Someone's asked, would it be reasonable to separate pre and post-mortem probabilities of detection? It depends on possibly, it depends on our understanding of the particular disease. If we got healthy pigs being sent to slaughter, I imagine that pre and post-mortem detection would be pretty low. The chances of detecting an infected pig based on a pre or post-mortem inspection, I don't know, it could be possible. I guess I'd leave that to other disease experts to answer that, but I would have thought a healthy pig going to slaughter, if it passes anti-mortem inspection, it's healthy. That would be a fairly low sensitivity. Is there any of the other folks got a comment about that from any of the other experts?
Mary Lou?
It depends, because if you've got a dark-skinned pig, then you're going to have to open it up to see any signs at all normally. Whereas if you've got a white pig, it'll probably have red ears and a red nose and a red tummy. And so for detecting antemortem, if the pig is in a clinical stage. If the pig is in the incubation stage, you probably won't detect it as African swine fever, either before or after, unless you test in laboratory. But I have seen a pig, for example, that had the pericute form, and it had nothing on the outside. It looked normal, a pig in good condition. When we opened it up, it had slightly swollen mesenteric lymph nodes. I would have said probably E. coli. And when the lymph nodes were tested, it was African swine fever. So it's really quite hard to answer that question. I think Livia might be able to help us there.
Yeah, I would imagine that, in this particular scenario, when you're looking at importing pig meat that you're not necessarily worried about the individual animal, the outcome from that, because if an animal was detected at ante or post-mortem inspection, let's imagine that you wouldn't be just rejecting that animal and accepting others. I would imagine that the entire consignment would be turfed out, but that's sort of where it really helps with scoping out the risk analysis to say, well, it's a serious illness. It can spread very quickly, and it has a really significant impact amongst susceptible species. Really high mortality rate potentially. So I would imagine you'd want to source the meat derived from animals that come from a certified free herd at the very least, or a compartment that's certified by the competent authority of the veterinary service as being free of, and that's based on a lot of evidence. Good biosecurity, ongoing surveillance, maintaining separation, etc. So it'd be really, you're mitigating your risk by the time the pig goes to slaughter. You're putting way less emphasis on ante and post-mortem inspection. You're sourcing animals from a known either compartment or specific herd of a known sanitary status. So you're mitigating your risk at that level. So ante and post-mortem inspection become not so important. I mean, that's important in terms of just, for general hygiene purposes, but that's not really relevant for controlling the risks for African swine fever, I wouldn't have thought.
Thank you. There's a hand from Livio. There's also a question from the chat box. What are the common chemicals used to treat swill to prevent transmission of African swine fever virus? That's from Uganda.
Oh, no, you don't. Sorry, but I'll answer that one. You wouldn't treat anything that an animal's going to eat with chemicals. It's not treated with chemicals normally.
Okay, thanks. There was a question too about exposure. Would it be reasonable to run a scenario for whether swill is heat treated or not before considering heat treatment efficacy? Yes, it would. Obviously, that would be important to know. So I guess that's sort of bundled up there together, but you can certainly tease it out and lay it out step by step. That would be reasonable to do as well. Okay.
Livio.
Thanks, Thomas. No, I think actually Noel answered what I wanted to say, and Mary Lou as well. Maybe just some background to that question. It is a very interesting question, but I do think both Mary Lou and Noel answered that. From a risk perspective, I agree with Noel. It's not that important to separate the two. But just from a South African perspective, both in 2012 and with our recent outbreaks, it is interesting that pigs did pass inspection at abattoirs ante-mortem, but post-mortem failed. So from that point of view, I can understand why the question was asked. It is very difficult to identify these animals ante-mortem with the numbers going through an abattoir. But if the health inspector or the meat inspector is doing a proper job, they'll probably pick it up during the post-mortem inspection, which is probably why the question was asked. But I agree with what Mary Lou mentioned and with Noel. From a risk perspective, I don't think it's worth separating the two. You're going to get the same outcome. Thanks, Noel.
Thanks, Livio. All right, so perhaps we should, there's no other questions. We could go to one of the other countries that provided a response to the exercise. Any volunteers, or shall we choose a country at random? All right, so maybe we need to, what about Eswatini?
I see that Eswatini is online, but Siri doesn't have a microphone. She only has a camera, apparently.
Okay, was it worth just stepping through I can just do a quick walk through the presentation from Eswatini? Just with some comments along the way. So Thomas, do you want to bring up Eswatini?
I'm sharing the screen in a moment. Eswatini. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's good. Okay, so if you could go to slide number 2. Okay, next one, 3. So they're looking at importing breeding sows from a country where African swine fever is endemic. And the factors they considered in the entry assessment, we're looking at, this would be part of the scoping of the overall analysis too. So importing from a disease-free compartment under veterinary supervision, where the compartments are routinely tested with negative results. They've got a veterinary service is considered to have high integrity. All biosecurity measures are followed during transportation of pigs. The ports of entry checks consist of document checking and minimal clinical inspection. And then the imported pigs are quarantined for 30 days at a government facility under veterinary supervision with proper biosecurity measures, etc., before those animals are released to the importing farms. So I'm assuming that this quarantining is taking place in the importing country, in this case, Eswatini. Okay, next slide. So the exposure assessment, the factors that were considered there, all the biosecurity measures followed during quarantine and transporting the pigs to the post-quarantine farm. The farms themselves don't quarantine new arrivals, but they do have sick pens where sick animals are maybe isolated. Animals that die are likely to be used as food. The farms are likely to sell sows to other farms. And then swill is used as additional feed on the farm. So these are the factors that were considered in the exposure assessment. Next slide. Here we have a scenario tree for our risk pathways for the entry into Eswatini for the sows. The pig is selected. This would be from a compartment, of course, from a particular herd in a compartment. Is it infected or not? If it's not infected, then the animal would be free, so it wouldn't lead to the outcome of interest. So we can see if the pig is infected, does it have clinical signs or not at the time of importation? If not, I mean, if the pig did have clinical signs and it was confirmed, I assume the entire shipment would be rejected. If there were no clinical signs, did it display clinical signs during quarantine or not? If not, was the infected pig then introduced onto, that would lead to the outcome of interest that the infected pig would be introduced onto the importing farm. Okay, next slide. The exposure assessment pathways leading from the infected pig being introduced into the importing farm, leading to susceptible animals being exposed. And we can see a number of pathways that lead to our outcome of interest there. So there may be, the animal has clinical symptoms on the farm, it's isolated from the rest of the pigs, which they're assuming does not lead to exposure. I'm not sure how you would effectively isolate an animal from others within the herd, given, you know, how much virus would be potentially excreted, and the contamination of the environment would be very difficult to achieve, I would have thought, on a particular farm. And then if it wasn't isolated, there's susceptible animals would be exposed. Then we can see if it died before clinical signs, was the carcass disposed of properly or not? Is the meat used for human consumption? Any leftovers used as swill? Is the swill cooked before being fed to pigs or not? And then that would lead to susceptible animals being exposed if following that swill pathway where it's not cooked or inadequately cooked. Okay, next slide. So now we're looking at the consequences. Next slide. So the potential consequences that were considered, it's introduced and spreads and becomes established. It may spread to vectors. Not sure what's meant by ticks question mark, with if there's a question mark there about the presence of vectors or not. Culling of affected farms and problems of disposal, movement restrictions may affect local trade, banning of exports, budget for other animal health activities being diverted to control AS African swine fever. There could be control and surveillance activities for other diseases, not quite sure what that means. Loss of jobs and incomes for farmers and farm workers that would be associated, I assume, with the occurrence of African swine fever on the farm. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're evaluating our likelihoods. Next slide. So in this case, they've determined that the likelihood of entry, answering the question, is the likelihood that the commodity, in this case, breeding sows, is carrying the hazard when it's imported, negligible. And they considered that to be negligible, given that it comes from certified compartment free from African swine fever, with a whole host of measures in place there that would assure the sanitary safety of the commodity, the breeding cells. The likelihood of susceptible animals being exposed, they considered that that would be negligible as well. I'm not sure of the rationale there, but we'll come to that. And then the consequence assessment, if susceptible animals were exposed, what's the likelihood for each and every significant consequence? Could that be considered negligible? They considered no. So we have here the likelihood of entry negligible, exposure negligible, and non-negligible consequences. Now, reflecting back on the presentation from last week, I suggested that if, when we're doing our risk analysis, when we've evaluated the likelihood of entry and we determine that the estimate there is negligible, then the overall risk estimate would be considered to be negligible, and there'd be no need to continue on with the exposure or consequence assessment. And similarly with the consequences, with the exposure assessment, if that's considered to be negligible, say, for example, against the backdrop of a low likelihood of entry, but negligible likelihoods of susceptible species being exposed, then we could stop the risk analysis or risk assessment rather at that point. Negligible being interpreted as not worthy of further consideration. In other words, it's your opinion is that it's I mean, we're never going to achieve zero risk. That's essentially unattainable. But I guess negligible is as close to that as we can possibly get, if you like. So the common dictionary definition of negligible is not worthy of further consideration, and we sort of interpret that that the risks have been sufficiently mitigated to not warrant any further consideration. All right, next slide. So can sanitary measures be justified? Next slide. So in this case, they concluded that sanitary measures could be justified, even though the exposure assessment was negligible. The entry assessment was negligible. So what options are available to mitigate risk? Now, I think we have to remember, as part of the scope of this risk analysis was that it was sourcing animals from compartments that were free of African swine fever. So that's essentially our measure, if you like. It's defining the commodity. And they've presented the options in the terrestrial code, you know, for importing live animals. So no clinical signs in the day of shipment, animals kept in a compartment free since birth, or at least the last 3 months, and then necessary precautions being taken to avoid contact with any source of the virus until the animals are shipped. They've also required, so that's what's in the code, and then They're requiring also individual or group identification for ease of traceability to the farm of origin. I think that's just routine, you know, to ensure animal identification is not necessarily a specific mitigating measure per se, but it is a good idea to be able to identify and trace animals anyway. And then the other measure they've got here is post-import quarantine for 30 days. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, which I think is the last one. Number 13. So how are these measures related to the risk assessment? Well, they're saying to ensure the likelihood of the commodity carrying the hazard when it's imported stays negligible. That's how they're justifying that. And what factors were considered? Well, they considered whether the measures would be technically and operationally feasible, in line with OE standards, and would they reasonably protect against the introduction? The only comment I'd have here is that the measure, if you go back to the previous slide, please, Thomas. Yeah, that's it. So we've got a measure here that they're proposing for post-import quarantine. Now that is not in the OEE code. It's not in the African swine fever chapter for recommendations for trade in live animals. This is a measure that ends up being more stringent than the relevant measures within the code, and it would require justification through the risk analysis, if you like. It may sound good to say, well, let's bring the animals into a quarantine within the country, the importing country, but it has to be justified through the risk assessment. And one would wonder whether how feasible that might be to quarantine animals for 30 days. It may be reasonable to do so, but you know, it would require further consideration or further elaboration as to justify going beyond what's recommended in the code. So that's an important discipline. And it speaks to, I guess, in some ways, how confident can you be about the status of the compartment from which the animals are coming? If there's some concern about that, maybe there's issues associated with your confidence in the veterinary service, or maybe there's been previous issues with outbreaks, uncontrolled outbreaks within the compartment, who knows? But whatever the reasons are, that would inform potentially of wanting to implement a measure that's more stringent than what's in the code. So we just can't simply introduce a measure without justification. Okay. Tim, have you got any other comments on that?
Getting unmuted here. No, I'd just like to reiterate your comment, Noel, about if the entry risk is nil, end of story, because thinking of ASF coming into, say, the US, if it were to come in, it's non-negligible that it would be established and spread. A consequence would be high. And if we are considering those two, then we would eliminate all entries or all imports. But if the risk of entry is negligible, I think we should be satisfied with that.
Okay, thanks.
There is a hand which has been raised from Dr. Roland Lamini.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for looking into the Swatini assessment. I just want to address the issue of 30 days quarantine. Basically, if you look into the breakdown of compartments, which has happened in the past, where compartments end up with the disease of concern that they were created to actually make sure they are free of. That window of quarantine of 30 days gives an extra protection just in case there's a breakdown of the compartment, especially when you are taking from a country where at the time of export, is activity in terms of the disease of concern. In this particular case, for example, if let's say there are ongoing outbreaks, not necessarily in compartments, but there are ongoing outbreaks in the country of origin, then you would want to take that extra precaution and put a 30-day quarantine. Also, I found that when you do risk assessment to actually just then focus on one disease, yes, it may make sense to focus on one disease at a time when you are doing the academic work. But in the practical sense, there are many other shifting concerns that you need to look at. And when you block them in terms of the quarantine for example, 30 days, then you are able to actually assess all the other diseases of concern. I thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roland. They're really good comments. And obviously you've provided sufficient justification for the 30-day quarantine. And that's all that's needed is, to provide that justification for a measure that's over and above what's in the code. I think that's eminently reasonable, what you've outlined. Mary Lou, you had a comment there about African swine fever not being airborne and maybe not spreading so quickly within a farm, unless fomites are involved. So I guess that was maybe a comment going back to one of the earlier slides talking about one of the scenario trees outlining if an animal was infected and became sick and was isolated, would that lead to exposure of other animals?
Yes, it was well commented. If you once got it onto the farm, it would spread everywhere. That's not necessarily quickly, and that's not necessarily the case with African swine fever. It would be the case with foot and mouth disease or classical swine fever, but it isn't the case with African swine fever. It has a relatively low reproductive number. And there were several published cases. There was one case, for example, where there were 9 pigs in Bulgaria in a backyard. And there were, I think there were, yes, 8 of them were on one side of this tiny, small little barn. And one of them, they came down one by one with African swine fever, but the pig in the pen on the other side of the corridor didn't get affected at all. And I saw in Mauritius a farm where there were 2 pens. The one was empty because all the pigs died. And the other pen was full of healthy pigs, which had been there at the time. And they were tested serologically and they were negative. So it doesn't jump pen to pen if you keep, but how it'll go in is obviously if the worker goes in and out to clean and doesn't clean his boots and that sort of thing. But it really, you could very easily isolate a pig in a pen at one end of the barn and the rest of the barn wouldn't be affected. That's just something that we do know. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. That's a good comment. Okay, so I think Eswatini, that's once again a really nicely laid out exercise. So well done, impressive. Can we go to one of the other countries? So we have Namibia, Tanzania, and Uganda, the other 3 countries that provided responses to the exercise. I don't see Tanzania online, but Namibia or Uganda, would the representative from either of those countries like to present the results of their exercise?
Israel from Uganda, are you ready? Israel from Uganda, are you ready to do the presentation?
Yes, I can do the presentation.
You can share your screen.
You help me share because
Okay.
I'm not on the phone. I mean, I'm on the phone.
Okay, give me a minute. There we are. A moment. You can see the screen?
Yes, I can see.
Yeah, tell me where to start.
I think that is the right slide. This is the most recent assignment on risk assessment. So of course, with risk assessment, we start with phrasing the risk question. So the risk question is risk of transmission. Okay, what is the risk of transmission of African swine fever virus through swill from homesteads and pig butcheries to pig farms in urban and peri-urban areas of central Uganda? So these are selected strategically because as these came out as some of the main routes of transmission of the virus to pig farms in the country. Next slide. Yes, so those ones are we have the entry assessment. So the entry assessment, we have two facilities. We have selecting the swill from the butchery or selecting the swill from a farm. Now the practice is such that when people buy the pork after eating, because pigs are very good consumers of the banana peelings, so people always throw them together. So you find that in the dustbin where they have put the peelings for matoke for bananas is the same place where they will put the bones of the pigs or any remains. So that's why there are two facilities. So in case there is no infection in any of that facility, then that's why we have the gray boxes indicate a dead end. Of course, there's no risk. But then if there is a risk, then yes, we have now the source homestead is infected with African swine fever virus, that is supposed to be ASV. And then we also have the butchery selected, of course, is infected with African swine fever virus. Then if yes, when the swill comes to the farm, then we shall have introduction of African swine fever virus affected swill onto that farm. Now, that is the entry assessment from the facility where you are going to bring the swill now up to when it reaches the farm. So at the farm, there are various ways of doing this. At the farm, you can either treat the swill, which is the boiling, okay, or you can feed the swill directly to the animals, which you see is the middle pathway. But then, even this, there are those formats you've used, okay? There are those containers. There are people who have touched these contaminated the contaminated swill can also present a chance or a risk of spreading the disease. So that's why there are three major pathways there. That is through we have one, boiling the swill. Of course, if you boil, then the risk is minimal. Up there, you see it is a yes. Okay, then it is a dead end. You'll have killed the virus by boiling to 60 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes. But then, if you feed the swill directly to the pigs, of course, it means you are exposing the susceptible and the pigs to African swine fever virus. Then also, we have the pathway via fomites, whereby if you do thorough disinfection of all the fomites which you use it and the personnel, then the risk is minimal. You have a risk there, there's no risk. But if it's a no, then you are going to have contact between the infected fomites and susceptible pigs. So all of those lead to exposure of susceptible pigs to African swine fever virus. So those are the two pathways that we saw were important. Next slide. So factors considered for entry assessment, there are biological factors. For example, transmissibility of the African swine fever virus through swill. Then you also look at the commodity factors. For example, what is the survival of the ASF virus in swill? Of course, it survives to some temperatures. And then the country factors, these are swill handling at butchery and homes. So here, in case the handling, in case it was very clear that the remains of the pork materials are maybe disposed of differently from all other refuse or the peelings from any other food, then there you would see that the risk would be minimal. But because it's not the practice, you find that such the handling of the swill at the butcher, if the butcheries were also also maybe disposing of the swill without giving to any other person to take for food as pigs, I mean for pigs, then of course the risk would be minimal. Then when you come to exposure assessment, now we are looking at our farm itself. Of course, we are having the biological factor. One of them, the example is the route of exposure to African swine fever virus. So realize that you are bringing this swill and the pigs are going to eat it. So meaning there is contact. So you are spreading through the mouth. So that is contact, and is one very probable route of transmission of the virus. Then here we also look at the commodity. What are you intending to use the swill for? If this swill was not made for feeding to pigs, and maybe it is for something else, maybe manure somewhere, then of course you'd have a minimal risk. You don't have fomites. But since the intended use is for animal feeding, then you see that there is a risk of exposure. And then still country factors. For example, how swill is handled on arrival at farms. If this swill is boiled thoroughly and all the equipment are disinfected, then the risk of exposure becomes minimized, and the reverse is true. Next slide. Yeah, so what are some of the potential consequences? We can have infection of pigs on farms, on a single farm, leading to deaths, hence production, trade losses, and then control costs. So this is what will happen, okay? And then actually this one, I have seen the presentation and I can make it better. So of course we can have infection in a single farm, which can be contained or eradicated, or you can have an infection on one or more farms, but it can still be eradicated in the same village. Then you can have infection on several farms in the district, okay, which may in the long run lead to spread maybe to the whole region or countrywide, okay. So the factors are considered in the in looking at these consequences are the basically management husbandry practices, which include biosecurity practices at farm level. So what happens when swill comes to the farm? Okay, definitely this one will give you that there is a risk or there is no risk of infecting the pigs with the disease. And then of course, susceptibility of the species. We know that pigs are very susceptible to what? To this disease, and therefore they are candidates. And then also the pig density on the farm. In the previous presentation, I mean on the chart, someone clearly said that you may have African swine fever on one pen, or in one pen, and then in the next pen there is no what? There is no swine fever. Okay, but imagining that one pen had around maybe 10 pigs, then it means all of them are going to be affected. And still also the construction will differ. If these pigs are constantly, let me use the word kissing themselves in between the pens, of course, that one also poses another risk, because that is now direct contact. So those are some of the factors which I consider, and I've given examples. Next slide. Yeah, so identify a couple of potential outbreak scenarios. Yes, we can have African swine fever outbreak that is contained at a single farm level, or we can have an outbreak which is spread, which spread the disease to several other pig farms in the district, all to in the whole region. And then of course the estimation, this is estimated like the estimation, the magnitude of the consequence for each scenario. One, for the smallholder farm, given our biosecurity measures, this one is very high. for most of the farms that have been affected with African swine fever, they end up losing almost 70% of their animals, and even the remaining ones, they are salvaged. So you have to sell them at a lower price than anticipated, than usual. So really, with the smallholder farmers, the magnitude of the problem is high. And from our experience, very many people are discouraged from engaging into pig farming because of the risk of the pigs dying from African swine fever. Then at the district level, it is high because by the time the district the district is aware of the outbreak, definitely the line ministry is informed, and they will institute a quarantine restricting movement of pigs anywhere in that place. So of course that means that even the people who do salvage their pigs, which is of course a risk of transmission to other areas, they do not. They will have no chance. Although there may be some loopholes in the enforcement of the regulations, is it really true that when there's a quarantine, these pigs don't end up moving from one district to another? That is subject to some further discussion, okay? Then at regional level, it is medium. I'm saying medium because the practice of pig farming is not like for poultry, where you may have this farm having 10,000 and the farm in the next 1 kilometer radius also has maybe 10,000. So they are scattered. Eh? So you find that the movement from one region to another is a little bit slowed down. Okay, then at national level, it is, I say medium because of we don't deal a lot in the export of pork. Okay, our pork is consumed usually locally. So I say medium because of that. It would be high if we are targeting the export market, which is not yet the case. And then why medium? Of course, there is revenue from forward and backward linkages of the pig farmers. What I mean here is there are those inputs required into pig farming. Of course, if the disease happens on several farms, it means they will not go for the inputs in the pig farming, including the commercial pigs. I mean, the commercial pigs like the concentrates. So that one is blocked a bit, and that is revenue loss for government. Then still, those are now backward linkages. Forward linkages, we are looking at the pork which is consumed over the weekends, or let me say just pork consumption. Okay, so of course the butchers pay some money as revenue. So all of that in a long run is lost due to occurrence of African swine fever. Is there any other slide? Okay, the likelihood of entry of exposure. Okay, so I finally concluded by saying the likelihood of entry of African swine fever virus on farms through swill from homesteads and pig butcheries is high with medium certainty. Of course, I will say medium certainty because most of this is subjective. Much as I'm speaking what happens, we may have no substantive data to report on this because of data challenges and data availability. So, but if we had the data readily available, then it would be with high certainty. And then the likelihood of exposure of pigs to African swine fever virus on the farms eating swill is high with medium certainty because these smallholder farmers are always faced with the balance between the input into cooking the swill, okay, which is another cost of production added onto what they are doing. So someone looks at buying, and these are peri-urban, definitely they use charcoal, okay? Charcoal is very expensive in Uganda nowadays. The price has increased about 3 times in the past 4 years. So when you look at all of those, these smallholder farmers do have limited capacity to enforce the cooking of the what? Of the swill. So that's why, and then the biosecurity is very poor, okay? Someone comes to, someone can have access to your pig farm anyhow. It is only very few, like 2 maybe, that countrywide, that are big producers, and they can handle this biosecurity. And then the likely magnitude and likelihood of biological environment. Okay, the magnitude of the consequence is high at the infected farm, medium at district or regional level. So this is the summary of everything. Then can sanitary measures be justified? Of course, yes. And then what options are available to mitigate the risk? Since our commodity, our vehicle of transmission is swill, so we have two options: either to avoid feeding pigs on swill completely, or boiling the swill thoroughly to temperatures above 30 degrees for 60 minutes. And then how are these related to the risk assessment? Of course, risk assessment helps us identify risk hotspots in the value chain, or let me say risk points along the pig value chain where intervention can be applied such that you reduce consequences. Okay, so this is how this is related to risk assessment. So if you know that the biggest contributor to spread of African swine fever is swill, we can legislate against usage of swill in pigs. Okay, and then it can save the pork industry in the country. And then what factors do you need to consider when developing sanitary measures? Of course, here, as I said before, it is first of all, the cost implication. We have a challenge in the enforcement. I mean, the costs of biosecurity vis-a-vis the benefits, because biosecurity, as you may know, is broad. Okay, you may look at the cost of having all this in place, your fencing, your pig farm, such that nobody can have access to it anytime, okay? Buying the chemicals for disinfection, all of those, okay? And any other things involved in biosecurity. So the cost implication, especially to the big producers you're looking at. For our country, the biggest producers of pork are smallholder farmers. So you have to look at that. And then the applicability of some of those biosecurity measures in the local setup. So to us, this is what we found as the factors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Israel. That was a really nice presentation. And it's also, I think, a great example of the application of the OIE risk analysis framework to looking at the situation within a country. So it's not just looking at imports from other countries. It's also useful for looking at mapping out the risk pathways that exist within the country. And there we saw looking at the value chain, part of the value chain, and helping to decide whether or not sanitary measures could be warranted to mitigate the risk. So a great presentation and a good example of the application of the framework within the country. I don't have any specific comments. Tim, do you have any comments or observations?
Just one question for you, Israel. Does Uganda currently have ASF?
Yes, in some districts, we have reported African swine fever cases.
Okay, because I was wondering about the potential impact on exports. If you already had it, would there be an impact?
As I said, when you look at our exports of pork, they are minimal. They are not so many. Of course, the impact would be there, but the magnitude may be of the consequence maybe would be small. That's what, because we don't export, we don't engage a lot in the pork exports.
Okay, good, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Israel. Has anybody else got any comments or questions? I don't see anything in the chat box. If not, maybe we could look at Namibia or Tanzania. Is anyone from Tanzania on the call?
No, there is only Namibia. Emmanuel, are you ready? I can share the screen for you so that you can carry on from there. Emmanuel from Namibia.
I think there was something in the chat box about him having a problem with the microphone.
Yes, I think you're right, actually. So, Thomas, maybe you could just bring it up and I could quickly go through it. Namibia's presentation, and then we can have a quick look at Tanzania before we wrap up the exercises. All right, so next slide. So for Namibia, they're looking at the commodity that they chose was raw frozen pork. The factors they considered in the entry assessment, the animals from which the commodity is derived, were from registered African swine fever biosecure compartments. The status of ASF in the exporting country, for example, no recent outbreaks in the last 3 months, which would be consistent with the code, I guess. The strength of the veterinary service of the exporting country, including laboratory capacity, the capacity of border personnel within Namibia to prevent or detect illegally imported pork. Okay, so there were the factors they considered there. The exposure assessment, looking at the pork itself being processed usually before it's consumed. Scraps would be disposed of and not fed to pigs. Apparently, there's a law in Namibia that prevents feeding of swill to pigs. Whether or not there would be illegal swill feeding or not would depend on how well the law is respected and enforced. In the case of pigs that are exposed to swill or uncooked pork, or if perhaps a farm worker has contact with contaminated pork, an outbreak is likely to be sporadic, as the population in Namibia is small and sparsely populated. I just wonder about the exposure pathway involving a farm worker who has contact with contaminated pork, whether that would be a legitimate exposure pathway, or is that ascertainable? Is that more theoretical than real or likely? I'm not sure I can necessarily envisage an exposure pathway involving a farm worker as a fomite, essentially.
I think it could. If he lives in a village where there's African swine fever, he might very well come contaminated if there aren't good security arrangements on the farm.
No, I'm thinking more about the commodity itself. So uncooked pork, I mean, there has to be, let's assume that there's no current outbreak. Okay. We're not dealing with that situation. We're dealing with, there's no outbreak in the country. The disease is not established or present, but we're importing raw frozen pork, if you like, and it's uncooked. So how would a farm worker handling uncooked raw pork, how would that then lead him or her transferring, I don't know how, any contamination on the surface of the meat to susceptible animals?
I think it's a fairly low risk, but people have been known to, maybe they thought the pork wasn't so nice and he thought he'd go and give it a little present to the pigs or something like that, if he got hold of it.
That would be feeding the pork directly to the pig. But here we're looking at the farm worker essentially as a fomite, transferring surface level contamination from raw uncooked pork to a susceptible animal. And I just wonder whether that's a pathway that would be more theoretical than real.
I think it probably is more theoretical than real. Although if he'd been sort of manipulating the pork and his overalls smelled marvelously of pork, the pig might lick him.
Yeah. Anyway, it's just a point of discussion, because it's worth just considering when we're mapping out our exposure pathways, that they should be ascertainable, they should be realistic and not theoretical. Okay, so it's a good point to discuss. But certainly the swill or uncooked pork, pigs being exposed to that would be a legitimate exposure pathway. So some of the potential consequences that were considered, the impacts on socioeconomic impacts, what size of herd it might be, for example, the geographic distribution of pigs, which has been stated in Namibia is very sparse. That would influence the potential size of an outbreak and resulting damage. Movement of pig, can you go back? Slide 4. movement of pigs, and then any movement restrictions would limit outbreaks on top of a sparsely populated. Okay, next slide. So some examples that were considered: loss of pigs due to disease or culling, loss of income from the household level along the value chain, onwards and upwards, loss of business due to movement restrictions on neighbouring farms. A couple of outbreak scenarios that were identified. Spread in the herd, might not be spread in the local herd if the herd is culled and disposed of well, so no further spread. If it's not culled and disinfection is done correctly, it might spread locally or to the rest of the region. Yeah, I guess if the herd's not culled and disinfection is not undertaken correctly, that's what it means. In the case of Namibia, the national outbreaks at a national level, the outbreak would be unlikely due to small pig population and being sparsely populated as well. So next slide. The magnitude at various levels, at the farm or village level, the magnitude of the economic loss was considered to be severe to the owners of the pigs, of course. Whether they die or are culled because of disease outbreak. There may be significant consequences due to a large number of dead pigs. And then we step it up to district and regional level. Magnitude severe to the owners and at district level. And they consider the biological consequences might be significant if there's a large number of dead pigs. Might contaminate water sources if not properly disposed of. I guess that would be more in the realm of a potential environmental impact. And then significant costs, economic losses to government associated with investigation of, and control of the disease. And then up to the national level. Pretty much similar sort of estimates there. Okay, next slide. As considered at the national level, the loss would be negligible because of the small population and sparse distribution of pigs. Next slide. Now we're evaluating the likelihood of entry, exposure, and establishment or spread of the virus. For the entry assessment, illegal importation of raw pork. Don't know how you control that really, other than increasing your border inspection. Exposure, feeding of the virus, feeding of infected scraps or contaminated fomites. Someone handling contaminated pork. Well, we talked about that before, whether that constitutes a legitimate exposure pathway in that scenario. And then the magnitude of the consequences arising. Of course, if the pigs become infected, there's a high likelihood they'll die. And then if there's a lot of death, then perhaps there's some environmental effects there due to contamination. Next slide. Can sanitary measures be justified? They considered yes, they can. Options available to mitigate risk. Import controls through permits with requirements and border control. For raw porks imported only from biosecure compartments. That would be consistent with the OEE code for sure. And by law, they don't feed squirrels. So I guess if that's if that law is well respected and implemented, that's a significant reduces the likelihood of an outbreak occurring. Whether it's negligible, I don't know, but it depends on how well implemented the ban on squirrel feeding is. Because it could be somewhat difficult to control, and maybe, you know, the law of the land, if you like, but how well do people respect that? How are they related to the risk assessment? I think as we've seen, both in the exposure assessment for sure, would inform us about squirrel feeding. Factors needed to consider when developing measures, the status of the exporting country, and I guess the import scenario, if I remember, was looking at importing from compartments that are free. And I think that's it, is it? Next slide. Okay, that's it. So once again, that's a pretty good exercise that Namibia undertook. I think we've got a pretty good understanding of the potential risk pathways that would lead to the outcome of interest and the potential impacts. And in Namibia, you know, low pig population, sparsely distributed, maybe the potential consequences may be more limited than other countries, but nevertheless, it would provide some justification for implementing some control measures, if you like, on the imported commodity. Okay, any comments from Namibia or Tim?
No, I'm good. I think you covered it, Noel.
Okay, so that's great. Thank you, Namibia. And the last one is Tanzania. I don't think we've got anyone from Tanzania here, have we?
No, they are not there. I think he has not reached his destination.
Okay, it might be worth having a quick look at Tanzania because there was a couple of points there that I wanted to discuss with the group. So we'll just do a quick run through from Tanzania and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, okay, let me bring it on. Is it there?
Yep.
Put it slideshow.
Yeah. Okay, next, there we go. So they look the scenario for exposure, entry and exposure of African swine fever virus through, so they're looking at importing pork from a particular country. And at this stage, what they're looking at is testing the pork. And if the pork is negative, that would be a false negative. And if it was passed, then that would lead to the risk arising, I guess, in terms of the commodity being contaminated or infected with the virus at the time of importation. If the pork was positive, it would be rejected, of course. Wouldn't lead to an outcome of interest. So the factors they considered: country X, the exporting country has 3 compartments. They randomly test pork for export, and they're assuming that the test has a specificity of less than 95%, and the virus is resilient. So we'll come back to talk about testing in a bit. So next slide. Okay, so there they're looking at exposure in the country. So the pork is being tested. If it's false negative, it will be contaminated, and then it may be consumed. But contact with pigs through swill or personnel, we've got the same sort of thing there, issue there, I guess, or potential pathway that we discussed about in Namibia. Now, is that ascertainable? Is that more theoretical than a real pathway, given the nature of the commodity and how it would be handled? But nevertheless, swill, if scraps are fed undercooked, inappropriately treated swill could certainly lead to exposure of susceptible species. So remember, in the exposure assessment, we're not trying to estimate the likelihood of an outbreak, we're estimating the likelihood that susceptible species would be exposed. Okay. Next slide. The consequences that they thought about, I'm not sure what's meant by whipping of the pig population in the area. Maybe somebody else has got an idea about what's meant by that. Restrictions on trade, loss of income at the farm level. If an outbreak extends to a compartment, to be loss of free status and hence additional costs to restore the status. So these are some of the potential consequences that we thought about. Next slide.
I think the whipping probably means culling. I'm not sure what the word would be in Swahili for, or the method that's used, but I think it means culling.
Okay, fair enough. That makes sense for sure. Thanks, Mary Louise. A couple of outbreak scenarios could be contained within the farm. So that would depend on the knowledge and how quickly the veterinary service can react and how well farmers comply. Perhaps the outbreak starts at the farm with a large number of pigs and the farmer is not aware. Start managing the disease and then later decides to salvage sick animals and sell the pigs that are not showing signs. So we've certainly seen that's been discussed in previous sessions too, that as soon as the pigs appear to be suffering from a potential illness or there's an outbreak in the local area, maybe some of the farmers might try and preempt their losses and sell the pigs, which could potentially lead to dissemination of disease, of course. Traders involved in purchasing pigs and transporting live pigs and pork to other districts and regions, and then spread to a large part of the country. So next slide. So in evaluating the risk, pigs in our country of origin, or pork in the country of origin, is derived from pigs from a compartment with standard management. This would be a compartment, I guess, that the country of origin can assure the sanitary safety of in regards to African swine fever. That would be, I assume, certified by the competent authority or the veterinary service. And that was considered to be negligible. Then they were looking at testing the pork with a test for the specificity of 95%. I'm not sure why they focused on specificity, but if you're applying a test for the purpose of importing, there should be more emphasis on sensitivity, because you're wanting to ultimately determine whether, you know, what's the likelihood of a false negative test. In other words, one that isn't the animal or the product's infected or contaminated, yet passes the test. So it's a false negative. And that's more important. The importing country was also randomly testing the pork. They thought that the chances or likelihood of infected pork, I guess, being disseminated to other pigs in the country was negligible, but it does have high consequences. Is there another slide there? So the consequences, depending on the knowledge and the farmer's reaction, the ability of the vet service to respond, through considerations there, smallholders were likely to have low biosecurity. Pig keeping is one of income generating activities, and disease will be established and maintained if that's the case, with this against the backdrop of low biosecurity. So it provides the opportunity for establishment and spread, I guess. For large scale level of biosecurity, these are large scale operators or piggeries, I guess, much better biosecurity, but these they own 1% of the pig population, so perhaps not a lot. Next slide. So the sanitary measures they thought should be justifiable, which would include this testing. The options to mitigate the risk. So they're saying the parties agree on the measures to be employed. That's obviously really important. So there's consultation between the importing and the exporting country. Looking at establishment and management of the compartments in accordance with standards, which would then be verified by the veterinary service in the exporting country. Traceability and certification of products. Testing of pork using an agreed standard, and then talking about transparency. I think that was the end of the presentation from memory. Okay, can you go back to slide number 9 again? So I just want to pick up one thing from this, the results from this exercise. Tanzania is talking about testing pork using a standard test. Now, I'm not aware, but perhaps some of the other experts can jump in here, but is there, because when I look to the manual of standards, the OE manual of standards, it doesn't talk about testing a commodity. The code doesn't talk about, the ASF chapter in the code does not talk about testing pork as a commodity. So it seems, from my understanding, that while it might be a nice idea to think about it, applying a test, is there actually a real life legitimate test that's available? Because if we, and maybe some of the others can jump in on this, because I'm not aware of that. So this would be, if there's not a test available, would be an example of wanting to impose a measure that's not only more stringent than the relevant international standard, but it would be impractical to implement, perhaps because there's no test, I don't know. So Livio?
Thanks, Noel. There is a test available, at least in theory. The PCR test is sensitive enough to use for this specific purpose of testing commodities. But the problem really is the application of it. So some countries, for instance, I know the US as well as Australia have been using the test in their national laboratories to screen imports for surveillance purposes, not for risk assessment, with relatively good success. But it becomes overwhelming quite quickly to test a consignment and to identify and sample a specific consignment becomes firstly very difficult. You're not expecting all of the meat in the consignment to be positive. The prevalence would be relatively low, so you need to sample quite large numbers. And then secondly, just from a cost perspective, it's very much prohibitive to do that. It's not the easiest test to do. It's definitely not the cheapest test to do. So although it's available in theory, in practice, it's something that I think would probably be of less use in terms of risk assessment.
Yeah, okay,
I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Livio. That provides some perspective. I think layered on top of that, would it be justifiable anyway based on the evaluation of risk, given that this commodity is derived from a compartment that is certified free of African swine fever? Even if such a test was readily available, it had a high sensitivity, for example, would it be justifiable over and above the certification that the commodity is derived from a free compartment?
I don't think so, Noel, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
The amount of work and the cost involved in it, I think it does not make it a feasible option.
Okay, so that sort of underscores that if we're going to apply measures that exceed the relevant international standard, there's got to be it's got to be well explained, transparently documented, and obviously in this case it wouldn't withstand scrutiny. It seems like it's more in the realms of being a theoretical test, one that would be very difficult to implement in practice. I was interested in your comment, Livio, that Australia and the US are having good success with the PCR test on imported commodities, because I assume that they're not finding anything and they somehow are indicating that that's an indication of how successful their testing program is. Whereas on the other hand, I would argue that by virtue of all the other factors that go into assuring the sanitary safety of that commodity, and without knowing the specific details, if those countries are sourcing pig meat from a country zone that's free or a compartment that's free, then that's enough. You don't need to go layering on top test after test or measure after measure, because I think we have to mitigate the overall risk to the extent that's reasonably necessary to achieve our outcome of interest, which is ensuring that the overall likelihood of a disease entering, spreading or becoming established is negligible. And we've got to be mindful about avoiding over-managing the pathway by applying a range of measures that may either not be justifiable or simply not needed.
I totally agree with you, Mel. Just maybe to explain the scenario, at least in Australia, I'm not so sure about the details of the US labs, but in Australia, as I said, they're using it for surveillance purposes of confiscated products at the airport or in as they come into the border areas. So from that perspective, from a surveillance perspective, it's been useful to identify products that could potentially have introduced ASF into Australia, but it's used, as I said, for surveillance, not for risk at all. In a risk context, I'm not aware of any country that's using it for the reason that you've explained. It just adds unnecessarily unjustifiable protocols on top of already existing protocols.
Yeah, sure. That's good. So it would be an unjustifiable trade barrier for sure. So yeah, what Australia is doing, I guess, is trying to get an idea about illegal importations of pig meat.
Yeah, that's correct.
And in that case, you know, they've got no other information about that commodity. And I assume that if someone's illegally importing the commodity, they're going to confiscate that and destroy it. But for their own purpose, to try and understand the likely level of risk associated with illegal imports that get through, it would give them some level of confidence, if you like, or understanding of the risk that they're facing through testing that commodity. That's an entirely different scenario. That's not looking at applying a measure to assure the sanitary safety of a commodity that's imported. It's intervening and confiscating a legally imported product and then testing that to try and get a better understanding before that commodity is destroyed. That's what I imagine the scenario would be. Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Tim, you got any?
No, I'm happy to keep moving on. Okay.
Well, thanks. I think congratulations to each of the countries that completed the exercise. Really good results there. I was very impressed with the outcome from the exercises. So congratulations once again. Thank you. So I'll hand it back to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you, Tim, for those able presentation of the exercises and guiding in the discussions. We are going to the last segment. We wanted to take a Mentimeter quiz, and but before we do that, I wanted to suggest that we take a 5 minutes break, and then I will hand over, after the break, I'll hand over to Patrick Bastiansen. Bas will guide us through that Mentimeter session, and then we close the session for the day and the training. So I invite all of you for a 5 minutes break, please. The break is ending in the next 30 seconds. So we are just doing the countdown for end of break, and immediately it ends, I will hand over to Bas to introduce and carry on the next session, the Mentimeter, which is going to be very short. Then we close this, the session and the training. Over to you, Bas.
Thank you, Thomas. So we'll have a short quiz on the risk analysis part that was discussed last week and this week, or today. So again, you've done this before. There are 3 ways to connect. You can use the link that I put in the chat box. So you click on it, or you go to www.menti.com and you enter the code that you can see on the screen. Or if you use a smartphone, you can scan the QR code that you see on the screen. Just to be clear, this is outside of Zoom, so you keep your Zoom going, but you use another device, for instance, or another application, such as Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer to access the exercise, or you use your smartphone. If you enter the quiz, please click on the little heart so that we know how many people are participating in the quiz. So far, we have 3 people. We only have 9 people so far. If you have problems connecting, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat box. I apologize for the background noise that you might be hearing. There's apparently a political or a religious rally going on. But I will hand over to Noel and Tim as soon as we start the session. Okay, I suggest we start. I'll take you to the first question. Noel or Tim, if you can take over, and I will manage the slides.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. So are we going to discuss the answers to each question as we go?
Yes, every question is followed by the correct answers.
Okay.
So these are open questions, so please just type the correct answers, and you need to enter 2 answers for this question. I hope everybody can see it on his smartphone or Internet Explorer browser.
Okay, so the first question, what are the 2 components that are used to describe risk?
Again, the larger the words, the more often the word has been mentioned.
How many participants did we have, Patrick?
We now have 13 answers. We now have 13 answers. 14. Okay. I suggest you go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Can I move to the Now just tell me when to move to the answers.
Yeah. All right. So just before we go to the answers, I think we've got a number of, we've got probability, likelihood mentioned there. Likelihood of something, that's good. So some of the answers there, like assessment, communication, consequence, hazard, entry, exposure. These are all steps in the risk analysis framework. So if we go to the answer, so the 2 components that are used to describe risk, remember the first one from last week was the probability, or in other words, the chances or the likelihood of something happening, such as the disease outbreak. So that's the first component. And the second component is what's the likely, or what the likely magnitude of the consequences. So that could be the scale of an outbreak and the associated cost of control, for example. Perhaps there's trade impacts and others as well. So 2 elements, the chances of something happening and what's the likely magnitude of the consequences if that event occurred. Okay, thank you. So the next question is, what are the 4 components of the OEE's risk analysis framework?
This takes a bit of time to type, so we don't have any answers yet.
Sure. How are we going for time?
In terms of time, I think we can wrap everything up in the next half hour, 20 minutes maybe.
Okay.
So 5 people have answered so far. We have 11 answers, so I think we can proceed.
Okay, so looks like everyone's pretty much on the right, providing the correct responses here. So the 4 elements that we introduced last week of the OE's risk analysis framework. First one is hazard identification. I know some people have got identification of hazard. That's also correct. The second element is risk assessment, followed by risk management or risk mitigation, as some have included, and then finally risk communication. So if you go to the answer, so there we can see the 4 components of the OE's risk analysis framework. Thanks. Next question. So if a pathogen is present in both the exporting and the importing country, under what circumstances would it be justifiable to classify it as a hazard? This is what we discussed in the hazard identification last week.
We only have 2 answers so far. Just wait a little bit longer. We have 8 answers, so I suggest to proceed.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I think so the circumstances when we can justify a hazard if it's present in both countries, the exporting country and the importing country. So in and of itself, for example, an outbreak in the exporting country wouldn't be sufficient in and of itself if both diseases existed in the importing as well as the exporting country, unless there was an official control program in place in the importing country. Some of the other answers include different strains. That's certainly, oh, sorry, I was looking, anyway, we'll keep on this one. So, yeah, so looking at different strains, there's a few answers there, new strains, different strains. So certainly that's another one as well, that it would be justifiable if the local strains are likely to be less virulent in the importing country than those reported in the exporting country. And then finally, if there are zones or compartments of different animal health status. So we could go to the answer and we'll see that those results there. So subject to some sort of official disease control program in the importing country, if the disease exists in both the exporting and importing country, unless there's an official control program in the importing country, it wouldn't be justifiable to classify it as a hazard. And the same if it's present in both, but there are zones or compartments in the importing country of different animal health status, that would be legitimate as well. And then finally, if the local strains in the importing country are likely to be less virulent than those reported in the exporting country. So they're the circumstances that would lead you to a conclusion that you can classify the pathogen as a hazard. Thank you. So next question. That's a simple yes or no. So can commodities listed as safe in the disease-specific chapters in either the terrestrial or aquatic animal health codes be traded without any conditions?
We have 11 answers now.
Okay, so the correct answer in this case is yes. So both the terrestrial and aquatic animal health codes for each chapter, each disease-specific chapter does have, well, a lot of them do anyway, commodities that are listed as safe. And that's by virtue of the nature of the commodity itself. So irrespective of the disease status of the exporting country, that commodity in and of itself, by virtue of the particular commodity, can be traded without any extra conditions, regardless of the disease status of the exporting country. Okay, next question. What are the 4 components of a risk assessment?
We have 10 answers now.
Okay, so I think we've got quite a few of the correct answers. Remember here we're focusing on the risk assessment itself, not the overall risk analysis framework. So included within the overall risk analysis framework itself is hazard identification and risk communication and risk management. Here we're specifically looking at the risk assessment step. And then what are the components of that? So if we can go to the next, to the answer. So the 4 components are entry, exposure, and consequence assessments, as we've seen with this morning's exercises, as well as bringing it all together under our risk estimation step. Okay, so next question. Which of the following is correct? So an entry assessment evaluates the possibility that the commodity under consideration is infected or contaminated with a hazard. Or does an entry assessment evaluate the likelihood that the commodity under consideration is infected or contaminated with the hazard? Or does an entry assessment evaluate the potential for the commodity under consideration to be infected or contaminated with the hazard? So which one of those is correct? There's probably enough time. We could go to the answer. So the correct answer is we evaluate the likelihood that the commodity is infected or contaminated. Remember what we're trying to do with the risk assessment step is to evaluate the likelihood or the chances of or the probability of, not the possibility or potential for something to happen. We establish context through an estimation of the likelihood. So that's the correct answer. So what's involved in undertaking an entry assessment? There is basically 2 steps, if you like, that we discussed last week. And we saw in the example this morning as well from the countries that completed the exercise.
think we have the maximum number of replies.
Okay, that's good. So yes, I think some people have identified some of the relevant factors that would be taken into account in an entry assessment. I was looking really for the two principal steps involved in doing the entry assessment, and we've got some answers there that indicate looking at the biological or risk pathways. And I don't know if the likelihood of entry, but let's go to the correct answer and we'll discuss that. So basically what's involved is describing our risk or biological pathways necessary for the commodity to either become infected or contaminated with the hazard when imported, and then to estimate the likelihood of the commodity becoming infected or contaminated when it's imported. So two basic broad steps. And then of course, there's a lot of factors that you need to take into account in undertaking that evaluation. Okay, next question. So just list 3 factors that need to be considered when undertaking an exposure assessment.
I think we can proceed.
Okay, that's pretty good. I think people are identifying some of the factors that need to be considered there. So let's go to the answer. So this is, of course, is not an exhaustive list, but it would include what you need to consider: the intended uses of the imported commodity. Is it going to be used for human consumption, subject to further processing, such as cooking, etc.? What are the impacts of relevant production, manufacturing, and processing methods, storage and transport, as well as waste and/or effluent disposal? The susceptibility of animals and/or humans likely to be exposed. That helps in identifying potentially susceptible species. The presence of potential intermediate hosts or vectors. human and animal demographics, farming practices, customs and cultural practices, and then geographic and environmental characteristics such as rainfall and temperature, depending on the disease you may be looking at. So, and as I say, that's not comprehensive. That's a lot of the many of the factors that you would need to consider. So you can see it's quite an expansive list. Okay, so next question. A bit hard to read this. When undertaking a consequence assessment, which of the following do not fall within the scope of an animal health risk analysis? So I'll just read each one out. So the first one is control and eradication costs associated with the introduction and spread of the hazard. Trade losses such as embargoes, sanctions, and lost market opportunities associated with the introduction and spread of the hazard. Benefits for consumers through the importation of a cheaper commodity. Changes in consumer demand associated with the introduction and spread of the hazard. The impact of the imported commodity on the competitiveness of a particular industry. And then finally, social or psychological effects such as the impacts on mental health and unemployment associated with the introduction and spread of the hazard. So just choose which of those don't fall within the scope of an animal health risk analysis.
I think we can proceed.
Okay, that's great. So the most popular answers, red and green, are correct. So go to or just stay on that slide for a moment. So yeah, so basically any potential consequences directly or indirectly associated with the hazard are legitimate in undertaking a consequence assessment. So the first one, the control and eradication costs associated with the introduction or spread of the hazard, that's legitimate. Trade losses, etc., associated with the introduction and spread of the hazard, that's legitimate. Benefits for consumers through the importation of cheaper goods, that's neither a direct or indirect consequence associated with the hazard. That's more associated with the nature of the commodity. It's not relevant to the hazard of interest as such. So it's not within scope of an animal health risk analysis. However, changes in consumer demands associated with the introduction or spread of the hazard would be within scope. The impact of the imported commodity on the competitiveness of a particular industry is not something that's within scope because it's not directly or indirectly associated with the hazard. And then finally, social or psychological effects associated with the introduction or spread of the hazard would be within scope. So the correct answers, as most people have chosen, the red and the green, are outside the scope of an animal health risk analysis. Thanks. So finally, the last question. Question number 10, which you'll be pleased to know is the last one. Given that the personal opinions and perceptions of analysts, experts, and decision makers are inescapable realities, how can we ensure that a reasonable level of objectivity is obtained when undertaking a risk analysis? What are two factors, if you like, that help us to achieve a reasonable level of objectivity?
I think we can proceed.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got some good answers there. Certainly looking at peer review and transparency, they're basically what I was looking for there. But of course, no conflict of interest or being unbiased, using peer-reviewed data, etc., all very important elements that lead us towards the two essential elements, if you like, that can underpin or ensure that we're achieving a reasonable level of objectivity. And that's, we'll see the answer in the next slide. To ensure that the analysis is transparently documented as well as undertaking a peer review. Okay, so that's the exercise completed. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking part in that. It's just to try and reinforce the what we've learned over the last couple of sessions, as well as the exercises that people completed. So thank you very much. And back over to you, Patrick or Thomas.
Thank you, Noel, for that ably guided session. I'm sure it was really refreshing for all of us who have participated in this training, particularly this session of today. It has gone much longer than we expected, but whatever has come out is very necessary because we gauge and because we have the materials, we have the notes, we can go check and practice makes perfect. And that is the essence. As you practice, you get to grasp the principles. And now we have reached, I was just checking whether the OI delegate Eswantini is still with us. Dr. Roland Delamin, yes, he's there. Because we are going now to the closing session. And I just, with no further words, I want to welcome him so that he can make the closing remarks for this training session and a training workshop that although it has been virtual, a webinar, but it has been very interactive. Welcome, Dr. Roland.
That's a serious ambush. I mean, really, how can you just from the blue ask me to make closing remarks for such an important exercise? But anyway, now that I've been given this opportunity, I think first of all, I want to speak on behalf of the participants, the trainees. We have really gained a lot of, we have gained a lot here in this exercise. Risk assessment, for example, while yes, we were looking at it using African swine fever, but it's applicable to all other diseases that we assess. So it is invaluable benefit to have attended this course. And the resource people, the resource persons were very, very good here. And really, I congratulate them for putting together such a nice program. It was virtual, but very interactive at the same time. The assignments were challenging, especially in terms of time. We didn't have enough time to always, you know, as a country team, to have that time to meet but I think that was part of the training, which is good, that we can then work under pressure, because in most cases when we do risk assessment, we are called upon to do it within reasonable time, especially because there'll be pressure from those that want to trade. So with this having ambushed me, the only thing I can say is thank you very much to everybody, Pastinson, everybody that actually made this exercise a success. Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roland, for those kind words. Of course, at OIE, for any activity we do, we have an evaluation, and I would want to hand over to Bas to guide you through that evaluation.
Thank you, Thomas. So before we let you go, just look at the link in the chat box, or again, scan the access to the overall evaluation and feedback form for this training. So this is not just about what you learned today, but what you learned or what you think of the training over the past 6 weeks. We invite you to do it now that it's still fresh in your mind. But know that the form will be available for the next 2 days until Thursday around noon. And we will also follow this up with an email where you can again find the link to the form. The form will take you about 5 or 10 minutes to complete. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Bas. Thank you for that instructions. I think you can copy the link. You can look out for the link on your email so that you can give us the feedback of your evaluation. We plan to hold other trainings in future, particularly in this field, and your comments will be very, very important so that we can do better. For the trainers, thank you very much for being very close to us and taking us through the entire period. With that, I don't have any other thing to add. Dr. Roland has already closed this session. I think just to tell you bye-bye. Bye-bye all.
Thank you,
Bye,
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for steering us through it all, Thomas
Thank you.
and Bas. Very much appreciated.
Thank
It was
you.
enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
you.
very much.
Bye-bye
And
all.
happy Christmas to everybody.
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Happy
okay.
Christmas.